Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome, listeners, to this latest installment of The Lens of History. And today, sitting on my couch, I have a very interesting guest, since we live in economic uncertain times, or at least a lot of countries do around the world. So I'm proud to welcome the author Kelly Mitchell to the Lens of History couch. How are you doing today?
Doing great. We're having 120-kilometer winds here in Cape Breton today, blowing snow.
Yeah, I'm accustomed to high winds where I live too, although we don't get so much snow.
Oh, yeah?
But just, let's
yeah,
start,
I bet.
let's start things off a little bit. Can you introduce yourself to the listener?
Yeah, my name's Kelly Mitchell. I am the author of Gold Wars, The Battle for the Global Economy, and another recent book that I actually published, the second one myself, called Invested to be Molested, Why You Should Fire Your Financial Advisor Now. And I also offer people advice on how to invest in the current economic climate, which is a little frightening for a lot of people.
All right, and I just need to put a disclaimer on air. While I give Kelly a chance to air his views, I don't in any way necessarily endorse the financial advice, so people go ahead, follow your advice and lose money. Well, it can happen, there's no perfect system, but shifting along, what motivated you to write the books?
Well, I'm primarily an author, and I just really love writing. I was looking for a interesting topic, and I'd been studying the global economy for some years, and I'd read another expose book about science and religion, and I realized this is a very hot topic. It's very interesting, so I put together the basic premise, and a lot of publishers and agents were interested in it, but one agent, ultimately the agents all said no. I had some smaller publishers that were ready to take it on, so I chose one. But one agent said, "You're not going to get a major publisher with this book because the big banks own the major publishers and they don't want this story told," which was interesting.
The topics you cover in your book, and it could be seen, and the global financial crisis, in your view, what role have they played in international events? So, if you take events in Ukraine as one example, do you think anything that you describe in your books related to what's happening there?
I do. At some level, it's all related, right? It's all sort of geopolitics. And I'm of the school of thought that thinks that economics is a branch of politics, and especially more and more so. And in some sense, I think that economics now dominates politics, and that's just a simple equation where money gets people to do things. You can buy politicians, and, people who doubt that, well, I don't know what to say if you don't believe that. So the crisis in Ukraine, I think the fundamental driver of political realities these days, at least in terms of the U.S., is the petrodollar standard and the maintenance of the U.S. currency, because that ability to put the currency out into the world and have anybody accept it is incredible power. And I would argue that is the fundamental source of U.S. power. I mean, if you can imagine yourself, if you could just print up $100 billion and it would cost you, I don't know, not very much money. It cost you some labor hours, a few $1,000s in paper and ink or whatever, and the machines and all that. So, and the whole world would take it. They would say, yeah, please give us that $100 billion. So you have an access to free money, basically. And that's the source of the U.S. power. So the U.S. is doing what's called exporting inflation. It's inflating the money supply. It's continually creating more money. And that game is coming to a close. Matter of fact, Saddam Hussein actually wanted to take euros for dollars. And that was not long before the war. Gaddafi also wanted to take other currencies for dollars. He even wanted to create a gold-backed currency, and he wanted to use that in exchange for selling the oil of his. And we see what happened to those guys. So one of my theses is that since the U.S. dollar has been severed from gold, it has now been attached to oil. And in the 70s, Henry Kissinger and some other people got the Saudis and all the satellite nations around Saudi Arabia to agree to only take dollars in exchange for oil. In return, they got U.S. protection. There's no in Saudi Arabia. And the only thing they had to do was take that money and reinvest it in U.S. treasuries. So it created a cycle that goes through. So the U.S. buys oil with dollars. The Saudis send the oil. The Saudis take that money and buy U.S. treasuries, and they keep cycling it through. It's another reason the debt complex of the U.S. is allowed to become so big. It's not $18 trillion, right? But many nations, and at that time they got every nation on earth, every oil exporting nation to agree that they would only sell oil in U.S. dollars. Now, if you can imagine the power that brings a country, because oil is the fundamental aspect of the economy. You need oil to do everything. To manufacture almost anything, you need that power. So all oil exporting nations took in dollars, and all oil importing nations needed dollars to buy the oil that they took in. So do you see where this is going?
Yes, it's a bit like everyone used to trade the British pound.
Right. It's a bit like that. The British system was a little different. I actually covered that in the book. You know, they were, the Brits actually just had a lot of gold backing their currency, so they had excellent credit. So they were able to do that. And then they lost that. That kind of failed in the 30s. And the U.S. had quite a gold supply. So it was able to carry that more or less from the 40s after World War II up until the 70s. But in the 60s, it started to get pretty shaky. The gold was being taken out of the United States. All the other sovereign nations said, spent a lot of money on LBJ's programs. He had a large welfare program, and he had a large warfare program. So those two things, satisfying both sides of the political spectrum, as it were, right? The conservatives get their war and the liberals get their welfare, so everybody gets their thing. But it created this huge amount of money, and so other nations had all these U.S. dollars, and since it was still backed by gold, they started saying, well, why don't we just buy some of your gold? And they started to lose more and more of the gold. And U.S. gold supplies went from 20,000 tons to about 8,000, and that's where it supposedly stands today. And that's questionable if they're lying about that or not, but I don't want to get into that. But during the 60s, they created the London Gold Pool, which was an open attempt to suppress the price of gold. It was not a secret. It was not a hidden thing or conspiracy. They just said, we're not going to let the price of gold rise above, I think it was $20 at the time. And if it does, we're just going to put a bunch of gold right on the market. And they had a group of nations, France, Germany, England, and led by the U.S. And whenever the price of gold went up, they would just put some more on the market. But that began to they were losing too much gold. So finally, in 1971, Nixon said, well, you can no longer exchange your dollars for gold. The dollar is now separated from the gold standard. Before then, the dollar was the only currency that's exchangeable for gold. So directly from the country, right? So other nations would just exchange their money for dollars, then get dollars for gold. So the London Gold Pill failed. The market beat it, actually. The U.S. and other countries were unable to sustain it. So Nixon closes the gold window. Now, it was a bit confusing for a couple of years there. And then Kissinger came up with the idea of this petrodollar, getting all the oil exporting nations to take dollars for oil. And if everybody that's selling oil will only take dollars, it forces all the oil importing nations to get dollars. They have to get dollars. So it makes the dollar very valuable. So that's one of the reasons why China accumulates so many dollars, and why it's been in China's interest for the past 30 or 40 years to sell a bunch of cheap junk to the U.S. in order to accumulate these massive reserves of dollars, because then they had to have all these dollars so that they could buy oil. And it's great. It's a stroke of genius, but now it's failing. The amount of power and the amount of dollars, too, that it's given the U.S. has kind of pissed off the rest of the world. And they're starting to say no. And the power of the U.S., they can't maintain that petrodollar arrangement anymore, because there's so many more dollars in there now than there is oil that's being sold. The amount of dollars has gone completely parabolic, and the purchases of oil have actually declined. Oil usage has gone down. Plus, other nations are becoming powerful enough to challenge them. They're creating alliances between the Soviets and the Chinese, and they're putting their hand up and saying, I don't think this is going to happen anymore. So in some sense, the whole premise of the book is this dynamic of how the currency and the economics and so forth has gotten completely out of control, completely distorted and unbalanced through the use of this fiat currency, this petrodollar. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, and just while we're on the topic of the dollar, can you inform the listener how you think the US dollar, the US economy, is going to fare in the years ahead?
Well, it's had a pretty amazing bounce recently. I would credit that to actually some serious problems that are going on. I think we're heading into another economic crisis in the next year or two. It's been about 7 years since 2008. And what happens when you get a crisis is people panic and get into the best currency, right? And that's still the dollar. It's still the biggest kid on the block. But it's been going down for quite a few years. I mean, the US dollar exchange used to be 120, and it dropped to a low about, I think it's about 75 or even 70. It's bounced up to, I think it's over 90 now. But I think what's happening is that there's a lot of derivatives that are going bad because of the collapse in oil recently, and people are trying to get a lot of cash, a lot of US cash, in order to pay off some of their funny speculative things they've done, in order to pay off some of the debts they've gotten into. I don't know how long it's going to take that dynamic to play out. That's extremely difficult to forecast. And I will say that anybody who tries to forecast when things will happen, I think is almost guaranteed to be wrong. It's a fool's game. But you can say this is a pretty likely scenario of what will happen. You can't say when it's going to happen. So eventually the dollar's going to roll over. It might peak up higher. It might go quite a bit higher, but eventually it's going to roll over and it's going to go down and down and down. And I think that China and Russia and maybe some other countries are going to introduce some standard of global trade that involves gold. I think gold's coming back. They've been accumulating a lot of gold. And once that happens, people are going to want that sort of backed currency, something a little more stability rather than something that constantly loses value like the dollar. So yeah, 10 years, I think the dollar will be more or less a strong regional currency rather than the global currency.
Interesting assessment you've done there. Can you tell us a little bit more about gold coming back, or how you think it's going to come back?
Yeah, it's a broad question in a certain sense. I think that, a lot of my book is about the manipulation of the gold market through selling artificial forms of gold, just like paper gold in the futures market, and through a lot of mechanisms that create a market supply of gold that doesn't really exist as physical gold. It's like they're basically short selling gold. So what's going to happen in terms of the market is there will be a separation between paper and physical. People won't want to buy the instruments that are known to be unbacked, and they will want to buy instruments that are physical. So it'll drive the price of physical quite a bit higher in relation to the price of paper gold. That'll be a major sign that gold is in fact returning to the market. I don't think this is going to happen without sovereign help. I think that the U.S. and the powers that be in the West can suppress gold pretty much indefinitely against just the normal market forces. And I'm different from a lot of gold analysts in that. Most of them think that the market's going to win. I just don't, because they've got too much power. They own the whole arena, right? But when China and Russia get in and they decide now is the time they want to end the game, they will be able to do it. It's going to have to be done by a globally, a sort of superpower, a coalition of, very regional, the strongest regional powers. And basically that's the Sino-Soviet alliance and the BRICS, the BRICS are?
BRICS, did you say?
Do you know who the BRICS are?
Did you say BRICS or Brits?
BRICS, B-R-I-C-S.
Oh, the British, yes.
No, not the British.
The difference in accent here.
Yeah.
Go ahead and.
All right. Let me turn on my Australian. I can say, do you know who the BRICS are?
Yeah.
the BRICS is an act. I used to work for an Australian fellow in France I managed a chateau for him for a while. Anyway, the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other nations around that. And it's a coalition of nations that opposes the U.S. dominated economics of the world. They're trying to put the U.S. hyperpower out of business. And they're going about it in a sort of slow, measured pace. But, Putin is standing up to to the U.S. in a sort of a little more confrontational fashion, and the Chinese are just dropping a lot of hints there. So yeah, I think the BRICS are going to be doing this. They've created a new central bank. It's about to come into its own in a few, in a year or so. It's a multi-stage process, right? But they're going to have probably a trade note. It may not be something that you and I will use for exchange. Maybe something that sovereign nations will use for exchange. But they'll have a gold-backed trade note, and then that will be the next step. So all these things are like steps and steps and steps. There's no sudden thing. A lot of people in the blogosphere think there's going to be a sudden upheaval and boom, everything's going to be over and it's going to be different. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be just one step at a time. There's going to be this grinding change, and there'll be crises along the way, but you don't overturn that kind of entrenched system overnight or in a few weeks. So, but at some point, China and Russia will choose to begin revaluing gold. They also have some market mechanisms. China sells, the Shanghai Gold Exchange sells gold, and it sells fully allocated gold. You have to have the actual gold to make the sale, which you don't in the United States. You can just swap gold around and nobody knows it's there or not. So once that exchange begins to take hold, that will push up the price of physical gold, and all the gold is being drained to the east. There's enormous footprints of gold bars. A lot of them are going through Switzerland, and then they're getting recast into different sizes, and they're going on to China and some to Russia, mainly China. China's really pulling in a lot of gold.
Well, I think Switzerland has a bit of a dark history with gold and other, objects related to the Holocaust, but we won't go into that now. But there's one question that's a little offbeat. I hope you don't mind me asking this, but for the sake of history and for the listener that's been following my program and blogging, know my prediction of what amounts to a world war. You mentioned Putin in this program, and the people you term bankers. To what extent do you think they are funding the Putin regime?
Oh, do I think some of the Western bankers are funding Putin? Is that your question?
Western bankers, Eastern bankers, you can define it as anywhere around the world. The question, I'll leave it fairly open.
I don't know. I hear things like that. I haven't dug into them, so I really can't comment on bankers backing Putin. If that is the case, because Putin is very clearly or demonstrably creating an obstacle for the Western banking establishment. Now, if there's some deeper game on there where he's in their pocket and he's doing that, I really don't know. Or it could be possible that he was, and they put him in power, and then he turned around and gave him the bird and said, hey, we're not going to play your game anymore. But I don't really know. I am interested in that. Do you have a theory along that line?
Well, I personally, I've never been that fond of the term bankers. There's been too much of a conspiracy angle around it. I do obviously have let people discuss their theories around it. I do think there are people that will finance any regime to make money. So whatever you wish to term them, I think that's really a side point here. And if I could just make a point here briefly, try to be brief. If we go back to Nazi Germany in the 30s, Putin's regime very much resembled, you find that people did finance Nazi rearmament. German rearmament was financed by what you would call bankers. And, somebody is financing Russia's military modernization program because their economy's not doing too good. It's a patch-up job, until they're ready to go to war. But that's another matter entirely. So, somebody is writing in the checks here, so to speak.
Well, Russia has its own currency, so I'm not sure why they would need an external source. If they can pay their weapons developers and all their people in rubles, then what would be the specific need for an external source? Why would they need to be financed by U.S. dollars? I mean, that's my first thought on it. Doesn't mean they're not, but I don't know how all that kind of stuff works when you get too into this, how the politicians are bought and paid for and how they work. I'm much more knowledgeable about how the market and the banks and the various entities involved in the financial markets manipulate those markets. And that's where my expertise lies.
Well, all I would say before moving the interview on is that greed is ultimately a very powerful motivator. Let me put it that way. And
sure.
Ultimately, I think that answers a lot of questions you like, but let's move along a little bit. And you mentioned another book concerning religion. Can you tell the listener a bit about it?
Oh, my other book? Yeah, well, it's got a bit of a funny title history. I originally titled it Buddha is an Atheist, a Spiritual Autopsy of Science and Religion. And it goes into some of what I see as the distortions of modern skepticism, actually. I don't feel that modern skepticism, I feel like it's lost its way and it's become it agrees with any kind of thing that supposedly science says. I think that many of the scientific theories have become somewhat strained, and as you say, they're co-opted by greed. If a very powerful corporation wants, for instance, a drug study to come out positive, generally it will come out positive. And that may not be objective science. It may have more to do with what people want in terms of making money. I think there's a lot of different scientific theories and so forth that have fallen under that. There's a lot more to that too. That was, I really enjoyed writing that book. But yeah, that's one of the basic ideas. And I think it was a response to this atheist publishing phenomenon. It got really popular, atheism as a topic in there, and I guess I'm sort of nominally an atheist or whatever. I'm a Buddhist more than anything, and so I thought, oh, that's a pretty interesting topic for a book. But I don't like the way most of these guys present themselves. They present the topic. It's very arrogant and very condescending and very. They more or less treat science as a religion. And I think science is great, don't get me wrong, but I think it's become very distorted in the past 20 years or so, and a lot of that is monetary and political pressures. So,
I broadly would agree with you. Not so much about science being a religion, but distortion of what scientific conclusions can be, particularly in relation to man-made climate change. I think that's, in my view, junk science. It's another topic, but I do think that is the kind of discussion people need to be having, much so about manipulation of science. Because there's always an agenda behind it, whether it be corporate greed, wanting to bring in new taxes. You do have to look into matters.
Absolutely, and climate change is one of the topics I cover in my book. It's not very good science, and it seems to have convinced a huge amount of the people that there's a terrible runaway problem. And like you say, even if you take the really strict statements of the IPCC on faith, if you say, okay, what are they actually saying? They're not saying there's a problem. At the core of the Working Group 1, they say there will probably be about 1.5 to 2 degrees change in 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius change by the end of the century. And that's not a catastrophe. It'd probably be good in a lot of ways, actually.
Before we wrap up the interview, relates to your other book, I've never really got the hoopla around climate change either. I understand people's concern about rising sea levels, but I'd want investigations of how much of that is erosion, and I would, or rather, I fail to see how warmer temperatures is such a bad thing when we're meant to grow more crops in cooler parts of the world. But what is your personal website? Where can people buy your books? And where can you be found on social media?
Probably the best place to get Gold Wars, or the other book is on Amazon. Just order it online. I got a website at gold-wars.com. I'm a little bit lazy keeping it up. Not too good at blogging. I'd rather write books. But yeah, if anybody wants to contact me, they can go to the Gold Wars website and send me an email. Happy to answer questions and help people out.
All right. Thank you for joining us on the Lens of History Couch. And I'd just like to add, so I don't get sued, if you follow Kelly's financial advice, it is at your own risk. I simply give people a chance to discuss their views in the studio. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Thanks for your time.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.